Welcome to Book Passage this evening, and thank you so much for supporting your local independent bookstore. We're thrilled to have you all here tonight. My name is Monica Golden, and I will be hosting this evening's event. You're in for a real treat. Book Passage is thrilled to welcome author Amitav Ghosh and his final installment of his best-selling Ibis trilogy, Flood of Fire. Anybody here? Have you read it yet? Oh, wonderful. That's some great conversation. From Bombay to Calcutta, Ghosh charts a course through the culminating movement of the British opium trade and colonial history. Flood of Fire is the compelling conclusion to his unprecedented re-envisioning of the 19th century war on drugs. His work has been translated into more than 20 languages, and his novels and essays have received countless awards. Please help me give a warm welcome to Amitav Ghosh.
Good evening. Thank you all for coming out today. I'm going to start by showing you a short film that my publishers commissioned. So here it is. Is that too loud?
The Hooghly is silted now, but was once one of the world's busiest ports. And Kolkata, or Calcutta as the city was then known, was the capital of Britain's empire in India and the hub of British military power in Asia. Calcutta is the point of departure for many of the voyages of the Ibis trilogy. The city was then, as it is now, a place of extreme contrasts. Some wealthy merchants built houses so opulent that Calcutta was known as the city of palaces in the 19th century. But the poor and destitute also flocked to the city in great numbers to seek a meager living.
During the years of the Raj, the British launched many wars, large and small, from Calcutta. My new novel, Flood of Fire, is about a war that has disappeared into the furthest recesses of memory in Britain and in India. The First Opium War of 1840 to 42, which was instrumental in shaping the world as we know it today. Of Calcutta's exports, the most important was opium. And the greatest beneficiary of the trade was Britain's East India Company. In Bengal, the company enjoyed a complete monopoly in the production and marketing of the drug, which it used to finance its enormously lucrative trade with China. The building in which the East India Company usually held its opium auctions was probably at this location. In opium futures, where vast fortunes were made and unmade in a single day, was in a lane like this one. The chief market for the East India Company's opium was China, which meant that a large fleet of ships shuttled constantly between Calcutta and Guangzhou, or Canton as it was known to Europeans. This connection brought many Chinese sailors, traders, and artisans to Calcutta, and by the late 18th century, there was a thriving Chinese quarter in the city. In today's Kolkata, the Chinese community has dwindled to a couple of thousand residents, yet traces of its past prosperity can still be seen in its temples and meeting places. A few members of this community figure in River of Smoke, the second book in the Ibis trilogy. We meet them again in
British colonies across the world. In this book, several characters from Sea of Poppies, Zachary Reed, a young American sailor, Neil Ratan Haldar, the former Raja of Raskhali, and Jodu, a young Muslim boatman, cross paths with Havildar Kesri Singh, who is one of the 4,000 soldiers who traveled to China to fight in the First Opium. From the other end of the main deck, Kesri drank in the sights of the receding city, the temples, the houses, the trees, as if he was seeing them for the last time. As the city slipped past, a strange, cold feeling crept through him, and he realized with a shock that deep in his heart he too had come to believe that he would never see his homeland again. One of the things I wanted to convey when I started writing the Ibis trilogy was an aspect of Indian life in which stories and shared histories and memories connect generations over periods of decades and centuries. That's been the texture of my life. Knitting together generations through their shared stories, the Ibis trilogy links the destinies of Calcutta and Guangzhou, India and China, a history of mutual destruction from which they are only now beginning to emerge. So, and now I'm going to so the flood of fire is set in the late 1830s, and I think we'll keep it down, yeah, because otherwise it will be hard to see the
Okay.
flood of fire is set in the late 1830s and early 1840s. And the novel's central character is an Indian soldier or sepoy who's employed by the British East India Company. His name is Kesri Singh, and he's the brother of Deeti, who was the main protagonist of Sea of Poppies, as many of you will remember. Kesri Singh is a Havildar or sergeant in the 25th Regiment of the East India Company's Bengal Native Infantry. This regiment is also known as the Pachisi, which means the 25th in Hindustani. The book opens with Kesri leading the battalion on a march through rural Assam in eastern India. As I read this section, I'm going to show a series of slides to give you a sense of what mid-19th century sepoy regiment was like, because it's quite different from a modern regiment. These slides are taken from a panorama published by Ackerman and Company, a 19th century London publishing house. This panorama was entitled Line of March of a Bengal Regiment of Infantry in Sindh, and it was published in 1845 or so, so it's almost contemporaneous to the period of flood of fire. Havildar Kesri Singh was the kind of soldier who liked to take the lead, particularly on days like this one, when his battalion was marching through a territory that had already been subdued, and the advance guard's job was only to fly the Paltan's colours and put on their best parade faces for the benefit of the crowds that had gathered by the roadside. Right behind Kesri's horse, following on foot, was the so-called Rasargar, the foraging party. Behind them were the camp followers, inaccurately named, since they actually marched ahead of the troops and far exceeded them in number, there being more than 2,000 of them to a mere 600 sepoys. Their caravan was like a moving city, a long train of ox-drawn bailis carrying people of all sorts, pundits and milkwomen, shopkeepers and Banjara grain sellers, even a troop of bazaar girls, and then a platoon of scythe-bearing khas cutters. To them would fall the task of providing fodder for the hundreds of animals that marched with the column. Behind them came those who would prepare the campsite, tent-pitching khalasis, flag-bearing thadniwalas, coolies with cooking kits, dandiya porters with poles slung over their shoulders, and of course, cleaners and sweepers, mehtas and bangi bardals. Next was the battalion's laundry contingent, a large group of dhobis and dhobins with a string of donkeys laden with bundles of washing. Animals too there were aplenty, noisy flocks of sheep, goats and bullocks, and elephants and camels as well, carrying the officers' baggage and the furniture for their mess,
the tables and chairs tied on with their legs in the air, wriggling and shaking like upended beetles. Then came Pagla Baba, the battalion's mendicant and mascot. Thin and tall, his joints were huge and gnarled, and his skin was smeared from head to toe with ash, as was his matted hair, which he wore on his head in a thick turban of coils. The English officers hated Pagla Baba, and not just because he liked to bring the blush to their cheeks by flaunting his impressive manhood. To the officers, it was baffling that with so many respectable men of religion to turn to, the sepoys should resort instead to a naked badmash who didn't even take the trouble to wear a languti and went around with his artillery preceding him, as if to deliver a barrage. One part of the caravan was reserved for the camp-following gentry, the Brahmin Pandits, the Munshi, the Bazar Chaudhry with his account books, the Kayas Dubash who interpreted for the officers, and the Baniya Modi, who was the Paltan's banker and moneymonger, responsible for advancing loans to the sepoys and for arranging remittances to their families. There was even a travelling temple trundling along atop a cart. After that came the jail party with its contingent of captured enemy soldiers, and then the mess train with its cartloads of supplies for the officers' kitchen, crates of tinned and bottled food, barrels of beer, demijohns of wine, and hogsheads of whiskey. This was closely followed by the hospital establishment, with its long line of canvas-covered hackeries carrying the sick and wounded. And then the battalion's drummers and fifers, most of whom were Christian Eurasians, and had entered the ranks through orphanages and poorhouses. Some of them were as young as 11 and 12. Only after all of this had passed would a rhythmic drumbeat make itself heard and a cloud of dust appear. The ground would reverberate in time with the beat as the first rank of sepoys came into view, 10 abreast, at the head of a long, winding river of dark topis and flashing bayonets. The sight would send the villagers scurrying for cover. They would watch from the shelter of trees and bushes while the sepoys marched by, piped along by fifers and drummers. Few were the tamashas that could compare with the spectacle of the Bengal native infantry on the march. Every member of the Paltan was aware of this. Dandiyawalas, Nach girls, Bangi Bardas, Saises, Meskansamars, Beriwalas, Pishtis, but none more so than Havildar Kesri Singh, whose face served as the battalion's figurehead when he rode at the head of the column. So, there we have Kesri Singh. Another major character in this book is a character. I'm going to shut this down now. There we go. So we can have the lights now, if anyone is here. There we are. So another major character in this book is Zachary Reed. Some of you will remember Zachary Reed from thank you very much. That's perfect. Thank you. From Sea of Poppies. Zachary Reed is actually an American. He's of mixed race. His mother was a slave. His father was a white slave owner. But Zachary was born a freedman, and he escaped. He sort of he taught himself carpentry, and then he joined Gardner's shipyard. From there, he found his way to working on a ship which took him to India. This is the Ibis, from which the trilogy takes its name. Now, Zachary, at the start of this book, is just emerging from a period of incarceration. He had been accused of mutiny, and it took him a long time to clear his name. But in the first book, those of you who read it will remember that Zachary works for an opium trader by the name of Mr. Burnham. In this book, Mr. Burnham is away in China, but Zachary finds employment with Mr. Burnham's wife, Mrs. Burnham, who gives him a commission to repair a boat. And Zachary is 21, Mrs. Burnham is 36, but they have an affair. And I'm going to read to you a little bit from one of their assignations. Zachary has crept into Mrs. Burnham's boudoir at the dead of night. So, Mrs. Burnham helped Zachary peel off his clothes and led him to the bed, which was covered with towels. When he was lying on his back, with his head propped up against a bank of pillows, she turned to her bedside table and picked up a small bowl. Placing it on his chest, she said, "Careful now, Mr. Reed. You mustn't move or there'll be a dreadful spill." Zachary saw that the bowl was half filled with perfumed oil, amber in color. Submerged in the oil was something that looked like a child's stocking, except that it was made not of cloth but of a transparent material, and was fitted with a ribbon of red silk at the open end. The ribbon had been artfully arranged to hang over the lip of the bowl, so that it hung free of the oil. Now, pinching the ribbon between her fingertips, Mrs. Burnham lifted the sock out of the bowl and held it up so that the oil dripped off the tapered end in a thin trickle, pooling between the ridges of Zachary's abdomen. "Do you know what this is, Mr. Reed?" His eyes widened. "Is it? Could it be a French letter?" She boxed his ear playfully. "Oh, you are too coarse, Mr. Reed. Let us call it a capote, a top coat for our brave sepoy, so that he shall never again have to suffer the ignominy of shooting his ghoulies into the air." She stooped to give Zachary a long, slow kiss. "I know how hard it has been for you, my dear, to so often deny yourself a proper spending. Your sacrifices weighed heavily on me, and you cannot imagine how glad I am that you will not have to do it again." Zachary was touched, as much by the tenderness in her voice as by her gesture. "That is thoughtful of you, Mrs. Burnham. Was the capote hard to get?" "Exceedingly, because I had to be so very discreet. Suffice it to say that on Free School Street there lives an Armenian midwife who is now considerably the richer." "It was expensive then?" "Capotes are only a shilling apiece in England, but here they cost twice as much, a whole rupee for one. And I got a few dozen of them so that they will last us a while yet." "Have you ever used one before?" He shook his head. "Mere carpenters cannot afford such luxuries, Mrs. Burnham," he said. "I've heard of them, of course, but I've never seen one till now." "Nor have I any experience of them," she said, "but I will do my best to fit it correctly. You can help by lying on your back and holding our brave sepoy at attention." Crawling across the bed, she climbed over his leg and positioned herself between his thighs. "I am told that capotes are made from lamb's intestines," she said, as she dipped her fingers into the bowl. "Is it not diverting, Mr. Reed, to think that the animal that fills our bellies with mutton ghosh at dinner can also offer us this other service at night?" She held up the length of intestine and slowly pried its lips apart, dribbling a thin trickle of oil down his stomach and groin. Then followed a few minutes of fumbling as she tried to slip the sock into place. "It is a slippery business, Mr. Reed, and our sepoy is making it no easier with all his twitching and quivering. Can he not be made to understand that this is no time to practice a bayonet drill?" Her face had sunk deep between his legs now, and he could see only her brow. A frown appeared on it as she concentrated on the ribbon. "Oh, I have made a mess of it, and must use my teeth to undo the knot." "Hold still, Mr. Reed, do not move." He was aware of the nipping of her teeth and the puffing of her breath. It blew on him like a warm breeze gusting against a flagpole. Throwing his head back, he groaned, "Oh, Mrs. Burnham, please be done, or I shall be fetched and finished." "On no account! Hold your fire!" He felt the flight of her fingertips again, and then she gave a little squeal of delight. "Oh, Mr. Reed, I wish you could see the pretty little bow I have tied for you. I am tempted to fetch a looking glass so that you may admire it." "No, please, enough." "Well, I assure you, my dear, there is not a bonnet in the world that sports a better tied ribbon. The bow sits upon your ghoulie pouch like a wreath below a mast. The Queen herself has never had a finer flag hoisted in her honor." So there's Zachary. So a lot of this book is actually set in the First Opium War. And the First Opium War, most of it happened around Hong Kong, between Hong Kong and Guangzhou, which was then known as Canton. And I'm going to read to you a little bit from one section of it. Now, as you may have noticed when I was showing you the slides, there were a lot of children in regiments in the 19th century. They usually functioned as fifers and drummers. I mean, I'm sure you've seen innumerable pictures of the War of Independence when you have these little fifers and drummers, you know. And they were absolutely essential to the process of battle because they would signal all the maneuvers, all the marching maneuvers, you know. So they actually went into battle with the soldiers, and you know, many were killed, you know, in battle and so on. In India, there was a curious situation where the fifers and drummers were always Eurasians. They were the children of you know, British soldiers. When British soldiers were in India, the British Indian Army had very elaborate measures to provide them with what we might call comfort women. And they were encouraged, you know, to take a woman and cohabit with her. It was thought to keep them more quiescent. But of course, at a certain point, they would leave, and then you know, these children would become. They would either live with the mother, or many of them were actually orphaned, and they would be placed in the poor houses and orphanages of Calcutta. And from there, they would often find their way into the army as fifers and drummers. And you know, they were sometimes as young as 10 or 11. So in this book, there's a boy. One of the major characters is a boy of 11 called Raju. He is the son of Neil Ratan Haldar, who figures in the first two books. And Neil Ratan Haldar, at the end of River of Smoke, ends up in China. And his son, at the age of 11, has set out to look for him. He's actually employed as Zachary Reed's servant. And but on the way to China, he's recruited into a volunteer regiment, a regiment of sepoys, as a fifer. So this bit that I'm going to read to you from it happens on the day of 7th January 1841, when the British launched this massive amphibian attack on the Chinese fortifications halfway down the Pearl River at a point called the Tiger's Mouth. The British at this point had a secret weapon, which was an armored steamer called Nemesis. This was actually the first ironclad gunboat, and it absolutely revolutionized naval warfare. You know, this was a very powerful ship with an incredible sort of battery of armors. So when it went into battle, what it did was it completely destroyed the Chinese fortifications, and then the infantry was sent in, you know, to attack the defenders. So once the bombardment had started, the band boys were allowed a brief rest. They seated themselves on the ground in a sheltered spot. As the barrage intensified, they could feel the shock waves coursing through the earth and into their bodies. The sound was so loud that Raju had to clap his hands over his ears. Then Dicky, his friend, jogged his elbow. "Look over there." Glancing down the line, Raju spotted a man coming towards them. On his back was something that looked like a dead goat. "It's the water carrier, the Bhishti, bringing water," whispered Dicky. "This is it. It's going to start now. The Bhishti always comes before the charge." When the Bhishti reached him, Raju drank his fill from the spout of the goatskin before filling his water flask. Then, following Dicky's example, he popped a sweet into his mouth. Just as abruptly as it had begun, the barrage stopped. A strange, crackling quiet followed, in which screams could be heard, echoing over from the Chinese lines. Then Captain Mee shouted, "Fix bayonets!" and the fife major began to call out orders in rapid succession. Suddenly, the boys were all on their feet, advancing in echelon, with the sepoys flanking them on both sides. Even though Raju had practiced the maneuver many times, he found himself struggling for breath, head spinning. In drills, no one warned you about the dust or the pall of smoke, nor did they tell you that the sepoy beside you might stumble on a cannonball's crater and lurch towards you in such a way that his bayonet would miss your face by inches. The noise too was almost overpowering, the sheer volume of it, the thudding of feet, the pounding of drums, the Har Har Mahadev battle cry of the sepoys, and above all that, the whistle and shriek of shots passing overhead. And cutting through all that noise was the eerie, reverberating sound of bullets hitting bayonets. Raising his eyes, Raju saw that they were now very close to the walls of the fort. He could see the heads of the defenders, topped with conical caps, desperately trying to aim their antiquated matchlocks, which were fired not with the trigger but by holding a slow-burning wick over the touchhole. Then all of a sudden the advance stopped. "Prepare to fire," shouted Captain Mee, and the sepoys fell to their knees to prime their muskets. On the next command, the soldiers and sepoys threw up a curtain of fire to cover the sappers who were racing ahead to plant explosives along the breastworks. In the distance, at the foot of the hill, down by the water, there was another eruption of flame as the Queen and the Nemesis began a second bombardment, aimed this time not at the fortifications on the hill, but the gun emplacements along the shore. Then came an explosion that silenced everything else. It was the blast of the sappers' charges going off under the breastworks on the hill. When the smoke and debris had cleared, Raju caught a glimpse of Major Pratt with his saber drawn, racing towards a breach in the walls, followed by a company of Marines. The band boys jumped to their feet, expecting that B Company would be the next to charge. But then suddenly, the Fife Major sprang up in front of them. Their orders had changed, he said. Instead of signaling a charge, they were to pipe the sepoys' column into wheeling to the left on the double. What was happening? Were they advancing or retreating? Raju did not know or care. His only thought was of staying in step with the other band boys. They were going downhill now, so the pace accelerated steadily until the whole detachment seemed to be running headlong. One by one, the fifers gave up trying to blow on their instruments. There was not enough breath in their lungs. Glimpsing blue waters ahead, Raju realized that they were almost at the bottom of the hill. Then the road made another turn, and they found themselves on an incline that led to the rear of the fort. They saw that the ramparts had crumbled under the bombardment from the two steamers. They saw also that the vessels were still abreast of the battery. The strip of water between them and the shore was filled with the bodies of defenders. Some were still alive, thrashing about helplessly. The British sailors on the steamer's decks were picking them off one by one. Kesri was in the first rank when the rear of the fort came into view. He saw that hundreds of Chinese soldiers were pouring out of the gates. He guessed that they were being driven out of the walls by the Marines, who had attacked the shoreside battery after storming down from the hilltop fort. Now the remaining defenders were rushing out to meet the sepoys in a headlong charge. Having endured a bombardment of terrifying intensity, they seemed almost to welcome the prospect of hand-to-hand combat. But the sepoys were prepared for the onrush. Falling to their knees, they met the charge with a barrage of bullets, mowing down the vanguard and causing panic in the ranks behind. And then, with the Chinese front lines already decimated, the sepoys fell upon the willing survivors at close quarters with swords and bayonets. When the two lines collided, the shock reverberated through the column. The pace slowed so abruptly that Raju bumped up against the fifer in front of him. Brought suddenly to a halt, Raju and Dicky stood motionless, fifes hanging uselessly in their hands. All around them, metal was clanging on metal, drowning out the cries of dying men. A few yards ahead, a fallen Chinese soldier had struggled to his feet. His clothes were scorched and his left arm was hanging uselessly at his side, almost severed at the shoulder. In his right hand was a saber, which he raised when his eyes found Raju and Dicky. Pressing up against each other, they froze in shock as the man stumbled towards them, brandishing his sword. Then Dicky found his voice and screamed, "Bachao!" And miraculously a sepoy emerged from the swirling cloud of dust and bayoneted the man through the stomach. Scarcely pausing to look at the two boys, the sepoy put one foot on the corpse, wrenched out his bayonet, and plunged back into the fray. As Raju's breath returned, he realized that his trousers were wet. He was staring at the dark patch when Dicky said, "Don't worry about it. Happens to everyone. It'll dry up soon." Glancing at his friend, Raju saw that Dicky's trousers showed a similar stain. So, I'll stop there. So, if you have any questions, I'd be glad to answer. Yes.
I have a question about why the British sold opium to China and not to India. Did the Indians not have interest in opium?
No, actually Indians did consume quite a lot of opium, much more than one knows. You see, what happened is this. In the 18th century, starting actually from the late 17th century, there was an enormous demand for tea in Britain. You know, it was first introduced, in the 17th century. It was actually introduced by a Portuguese woman, Catherine of Braganza, who, as her dowry, brought the island of Bombay and a great cask of tea, because the Portuguese at that point were the main traders with China, and they had Macau, you know. So Catherine of Braganza introduced tea into Britain, but it quickly caught on and became a very, very important commodity. It became so important by the late 18th century that it was one of Britain's largest revenue earners. In fact, 10% of the Crown's revenues came from the tax on tea. The tax on tea alone was enough to finance all of Britain's non-military expenditures. All public building, everything could have been financed by the tax on tea. So, but unfortunately for them, they had to pay for this tea with silver, because the Chinese were not interested in buying any British goods. They thought, rightly or wrongly, that anything the British could make, they could make better. So they had no interest in buying any British goods, so the British had to pay currency, silver currency, which led to an enormous balance of payments problem. So by the 1760s, the British faced this incredible problem. They couldn't find any more silver. They had to find some commodity to trade to China. And at this point, the leaders of the British East India Company sat down in Calcutta, and they came up with this very deliberate plan to grow opium, to expand. There was a small trade in medicinal opium. So in a period of 30 or 40 years, they increased the acreage of opium 100-fold, of poppies. Their production increased 100-fold. So, by the 1830s, the Chinese were facing a tsunami of opium coming to them from British India, And sure enough, the British were completely right. I mean, within these 20 or 30 years, the balance of payment situation completely reversed itself. The Chinese were then hemorrhaging silver to Britain, and they faced this enormous problem of public health as well as public finances, And they had declared opium illegal actually in the mid 18th century. So from the late, through the 18th century, early 19th century, opium was illegal. So all these British people were smuggling. But, the second largest group of smugglers were Americans. And not just any Americans. These were some of the most distinguished Americans in the history of the country. The Coolidge family. I recently found myself in Chicago. I was sitting next to a Coolidge at a dinner. And I said, Coolidge. Do you know that your ancestor had made his money in trading opium in India and China? He looked completely shocked and said, but his wife was very excited. She said, look, listen to him. I could see that he'd been giving her this spiel about how they were Boston Brahmins. But it's extraordinary, it's not just that. Then Franklin Delano Roosevelt, all his money came from his grandfather, Andrew Delano, who made his money in opium in China. Similarly, the Forbes family, John Forbes Kerry, your Secretary of State, his family money came from opium. All these big East Coast educational institutions, Brown University, Harvard, Yale, all of them, opium money was central to it. So it's a very strange thing, actually, that this whole history of opium is so papered over, because really the first narco state was the East India Company, really. It financed its operations entirely through opium. Yes.
So I finished Sea of Poppies and I'm a little bit of the way through River of Smoke, and one of the things I love about those books is your use of language and dialect, etc. And it took a little getting used to, but it also, in my mind, makes the books a little less accessible to more mass audiences. And yet it really gives color and flavor to the books when you start to assimilate it. And I'm curious as to your thinking behind that, whether or not you were concerned about that or not, because there's so much richness in whether it's the Lascars or the British dialects of the time, or Hindustanis or what have you. So I'm just curious about your thoughts about that.
I personally feel that one should not write with an audience in mind, I mean, because the moment you start doing that, I think readers are very intelligent people, and they understand when you're just pandering to them, or when you're trying to, as it were, market something, I think it happens the other way around. I think writers create their own audiences, if you like. And my audiences have grown accustomed to stuff like this, if you like. But what I was really trying to do was, in a sense, to recreate my own experience of reading, and not just my own. I mean, for example, when I, as a child in India, was reading, books in English, half the things that were in the books, I had never heard of or seen, like hot dogs and crumpets and daffodils and so on. So these things were completely foreign to me, and yet they were never a barrier. I mean, even though I didn't know what a hot dog was, I mean, I could sense that it was something that you ate, and really, even if you had a dictionary entry of what a hot dog is, it still won't give you anything of a sense of a hot dog. So that's the great sense. So, I mean, that's the great power of language, that, so much of meaning is communicated through context. And the other great thing about language is that it has this wonderful thing called redundancies, So that's what I work on, very hard, actually, so that the reader isn't actually left behind. If you look at, say, for example, just this first part that I read to you, I said that, flag-bearing Tharniwalas. So that already tells you that Tharniwala is bearing a flag, So in those ways, you can build redundancies into it, which helps you, which helps the reader get a picture of it. Secondly, I think that it's not just me who has this experience of reading. Even in America, say for example, when you read Herman Melville's Moby Dick, so much of it is nautical language, And I've often had this experience. I ask, an audience of Americans, how many of you know what a mizzenmast is? And really nobody knows. And yet they read Herman Melville without any difficulty, and because it's something to do with the ship. What you need to know. So I don't think it really forms a barrier. I think, on the other hand, it creates a kind of space, which you begin to inhabit, and you. Yes.
With the amount of knowledge I'm just in awe. I wonder how much research you have to do every time, but I'm sure you do a lot of research before you.
I do.
But I'm just wondering, there's always this juxtapositioning that a writer has to think about between the historical details and the knowledge that you have and the fiction itself. And I don't know how to put this, but very often the details get in the way of the fiction, of the story. So how are you able to justify, what is your theory about this?
I think no one is going to read a novel for the history.
Right.
If they'd rather read a book of history, if that's their primary interest. But I do feel that, when you're writing a novel, you have to keep in mind that novels, in the end, are always about characters, and they're about narrative, So that's the way I set about it, really, it's the characters and the narrative that drive my research, So, for example, if I'm writing, let's say, this scene on a battlefield, it's not that I do all the research first and then, get into the writing. As this character is going into the field, I ask myself questions like, what was he wearing? What was the weather like? What sort of armaments would he have used? What would have been the experience of battle in that time? So it's those things that come together. It's the characters who drive the research, so to speak. And it is very hard to find a proper balance, because you see, the problem for us who are writing about India and Asia and so on in this period is that we face a situation that's quite different from, say, someone writing about America in the 19th century or Europe in the 19th century or whatever. Because, for America, for Europe, we already have visual images of what life was like. For example, if you want to describe a ballroom, or a dance or something, everybody has in their mind some visual imagery of it, or a banquet or whatever. But when you're writing about an Asian circumstance, nobody has that visual imagery, of the 19th century. So you're simultaneously, as it were, creating the infrastructure and then populating it, So it's a different. It's very demanding in that sense. Yes.
The Ibis trilogy covers such a wide array of people, places, times, and history. I mean, it's quite astonishing, really. When you sat down to write The Sea of Poppies, did you have a sense then of what the arc was going to be, who the characters would be, who would enter the trilogy, and how the entire story would play out? Did you have a sense for it at the beginning?
I had no sense of how the story would play out, but my intuition of it really was that it would be a multi-generational story ending up in the 20th century. And after 10 years and 1,600 pages and ultimately, thousands of words, hundreds of thousands of words, I've really, the action has advanced by 3 years. Yes.
How do you stay, in those worlds while you're writing? Like, do you find when you leave the house that you have this kind of like overlay of the 19th century as you're wandering around New York? Or go on, or do you keep it at your desk?
By a sort of strange coincidence, where I live, I live half the year in Brooklyn and half the year in India, in Goa. But Brooklyn was actually one of the great 19th century opium trading centers. Often in these, when I look at the documents, they come from Brooklyn, and I often go and look for the houses and so on. And I live in a 19th century house, almost contemporaneous with this. And I think that really helps. It gives you a sense. But yes, I do inhabit. I do inhabit that space in a very deliberate way. I mean, in the morning, when I get up and go to my desk, there's this long period of, like a couple of hours when you're just separating yourself from the world, and you're just sinking into this kind of tunnel. And, I was doing this for 11 years, really, and I often used to feel that I'm doing exactly the opposite of what everyone else in the world is doing. Everyone else is now attention distracted, they're doing this and that, and here I am just sunk inside this long tunnel. There you are. Anyway, yes.
I've only read The Hungry Tide and I loved it. Can you talk about why it's so different from the others in the trilogy? What made you go in that direction?
Thank you. I don't think it is. It is very different. It's not a historical novel in that sense, though a lot of history enters into it. In The Hungry Tide, really, I was exploring my interest in the natural world, in nature, how we inhabit nature, how we get into it, what it becomes for us. And I think that has been a long interest of mine. And in these books too, in River of Smoke, a lot of it is about naturalists. It's about the great botanical exchanges of the 19th century. So, I mean, those ideas have spilt over, if you like. But, The Hungry Tide for me was also, I'm from Bengal. I had a close connection with these forests, these mangrove forests, which are actually the most threatened the most threatened by climate change. Already, we see those forests disappearing, and I felt this great urgency about it. I felt I had to be able to speak of it, so to speak. Yes, that must be the last one, I think. Right?
So, yes, last.
What's next?
I'm doing 2 short books and non-fiction books, so that's it'll be a nice change from all this. Well, thank you all very much. Thank you for coming.